Some of you in this audience will be aware that it is the 150th anniversary of the first colour photograph, which I'm showing you here, which was projected at a lecture at the Royal Institute by Maxwell. At the time, he was working at King's College, and there's an event to mark the celebration of this in May, I think it's May the 19th, with a series of lectures on colour vision, and if any of you have any interest, I'd urge you to go. It's in the Old Anatomy Theatre in the afternoon. So this is the photograph of the tartan ribbon, which was taken using the first SLR, which had been invented by his friend, and he took 3 pictures using 3 different filters and then was able to project this gorgeous image for the first time ever, showing 3 different colours. Now, in this lecture, there's a number of sources I put over here. There's also other sources which are mentioned in previous lectures, and I'm not repeating them because of time and space. This lecture is going to concern what is colour, and then what's colour vision. Not necessarily the same things. We're going to talk about train crashes and colour blindness, which is quite gruesome, and then an antique use of colour and pigments, ancient red Welsh ladies, the meaning of colour in medieval Europe, discovery of the new pigments, talking about colour, language and colour, colour systems, and the psychology of colour. So there's a fair ground to cover here, because colour is probably one of the most complex issues that we deal with, and secondly is gorgeous and rich and has so many aspects to it. So the idea of this lecture is to give an overview of the whole field of colour, but not going into depth particularly with any aspects in particular. Obviously, colour is a function of light, because without light we can't see colour, and light's that part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. And it's only a tiny bit of the spectrum that we can see. We can't see X-rays and microwaves, and we can't see radio waves, and we can't see infrared. The sun is irradiating this cacophony of electromagnetic radiation to us, and from this we select this small little window because we've developed receptors that can detect this small little bit here. If we hadn't have developed those receptors, we would live in a dark universe. If we hadn't have developed receptors that can feel heat from the infrared end, we'd have been living in a cold, dark universe, which is what it is. The bit that's not cold and the bit that's not dark is the bit we make up in our heads, and we've discussed that at some length in previous lectures. Now, these photons of light are captured by the receptors to make an electrical signal, and it goes to the brain and we see. But remember what Isaac Newton said. For the rays to speak properly, that's the rays themselves, they're not coloured. It's in them, there's nothing else than a power and a disposition to stir up a sensation, and this or that colour. I'll explain what I mean. Colour is actually a noun for the spectral composition of light, and it derives from color, the Latin, combined with the Anglo-Norman colour, which actually explains once and for all why the Americans can't spell and we can. Colour vision is the capability of discriminating between light sources on the basis of their emitted or reflected wavelengths, and that's called their spectral content. Now, what do I actually mean by that? What I mean here is that if we only have one type of receptor and we've got a mixed bag of radiation coming in, we have short wavelengths and we have long wavelengths, there's no way we can discriminate between the two. What we need is to have at least 2 different types of receptors. Now we have one that's going to fire maximally to the short wave, often blue light, and one that's going to fire maximally to the longer wavelengths, as you can see here. So now we've got an ability to differentiate between the spectral composition of what's coming in. We can tell whether this light is more reddish, if you like, or whether it's more bluish, if you like. That's not actually done in the retina. And it turns out that, in fact, that's exactly what happens in animals. We do have different receptors, some responding to the long, some responding to the short, and some responding to some in between. And if you're a mantis shrimp, a whole heap of others in between, which we'll talk to, including some that go to the ultraviolet. Spectral sensitivity is how these receptors respond maximally, and you can see at this wavelength we're getting a lot of response, at this wavelength we're not getting very much response at all, and at this wavelength there's no response. And this particular receptor responds maximally at this wavelength. We could call it a short wave length receptor, or if you like, a blue receptor. And this one could be a green receptor, but as you can see, it's not exactly green, it's sort of somewhere in between. And this one is a long-wave receptor, which is red. You'll notice that the spectral composition of these two is very close, and that's due to a gene reduplication. They're very, very closely related genes. So remember, the receptor, when it's firing, is not saying, hey, all it's saying is I'm responding. It's not saying, hey, I'm responding and I'm greenish. All it's doing is responding maximally here to say, this spectral composition really excites me. How we get the greenish bit is comparing the response to any particular gamut of light that comes in, comparing those three responses and adding them up. And that is done at a different layer. Now remember, we've spoken about this before, because these two colours are exactly the same, but compared to their background, they're looking very different. And that's because of what's happening in the ganglion cell layers in the retina, which, because this is not a MAC, it's a gorgeous diagram here, if you can imagine, that shows all the bipolar cells. But you're probably lucky it's not there, because that's quite boring. But just suffice to say, there is a little bit that actually does that processing. Thank goodness this map is here, because this is a map of the brain. We've seen this before, but we've not seen this wiring, because this is the colour wiring. This is the first stage where the neurons come in from the lower visual system into the brain, and we know it's layered up, and this white layer here was the stripe of Gennari. We're going to ignore that for the moment. We're looking at these things called blobs, which are in between. And this is where the colour processing occurs. It comes to the next layer. This is called V1, the first visual area. The next adjacent bit in the brain surrounding it is V2, which is the second visual area. And this is composed of thin stripes and thick stripes, and these things that are called interstripes. So the thin stripes are interested here, and there's a number of clusters of cells that are concerned with the colour of the objects that are being seen. And there's also luminance channels that tune this up or tune this down, comparing to the luminance of the stimulus that's been sent up from the blob area here. From here, they go to another layer, which is V4, which was discovered by Semir Zeki in University College London. And here, form and colour come together so that we can start to classify things in the visual scene as coloured. Now, colour blindness is something that vexes people when they first come across it. This amazing chap, John Dalton, who was a Quaker from the Lake District, moved to teach at the New College in Manchester because, of course, Oxford and Cambridge didn't allow people who were not of the mainstream religion in those days. And in 1789, the Philosophical and Literary Society of Manchester, he publishes his paper on extraordinary facts relating to the vision of colour. And essentially what he found out was that he was seeing colours different from other people. And an amazing thing happened. He worked out that he was missing something that other people had. Now this is the unknown unknowns of Donald Rumsfeld. They're very, very difficult things to work out. And people who work out these things truly are geniuses. And he went on to discover other things like Daltonism, which is the colour blindness here, the atomic weight so is attached to his name even to this day from his theories. Let's see what Daltonism is. If we have a mother who's in pink, because we're not sexist, and a daddy who's in blue, because we're not sexist, what happens is they have 4 putative children, and being a democracy, they actually split the genes up properly and equally. So we have a boy who's in blue, who has normal colour vision. He's got the blue, which is on another chromosome, and the red and green, and so he's got these responses. And he can now make, across the gamut of light, a pretty average and good response and have a full sensation of primate colour vision. What happens here? He has a daughter, and this daughter's inherited the normal, and of course, the same thing, normal colour vision. Let's look at this daughter here. Now, she's inherited this defective gene where the green is not quite as good, the middle, the M receptor. And what happens is that because she can use this chromosome, because you only need one lot of genes, you've got one lot that's spare, she makes normal colour. She's called a carrier, or you could call her, I suppose, the carrier of this gene. She will be like her mother, and it has the potential for passing on colour deficiency to her children, to her male children. Now look at this boy here. He's got a problem because, as we know, boys are X-deficient females. They have the bad gene, or the different gene. And his colour perception now is shifted over here, close to the red. So he's going to discriminate less colours than his siblings will. Now, Dalton didn't have this. This is called deuteranomaly, which is an anomalous second pigment. Deutero, second, anomaly, anomalous. What Dalton had was this. He actually missed the pigment altogether. The gene was deleted, or the effective product from the gene was not being made. And we know that because he left his eyes in a bottle and said, one day someone's going to find out what's wrong with me. And about 15 years ago, when I was in Manchester, there was a conference on colour vision, and someone took the eyes out of the bottle and did PCR analysis and found out the genetics and proved that Dalton was right all along. He was missing something. He thought it was because he had coloured oil droplets between the eyes and the receptors, which were affecting colour in one of the receptors. And interesting enough, that is actually how some animals do colour vision. They have different coloured oil drops in their receptors to fine-tune. So here he is, sitting in Manchester Town Hall in his regal splendour. Because it's the second pigment that's missing, it's called deuteranopia. Now, he can still make them because he's got this pigment here, which is not X-linked, that comes off a different chromosome. And he's got this one, which is fine, so you can see some colours, but his depth and range of colours, as he describes in the article and in his lecture, are not so good. This is a little bit more severe. Protanopia, they're missing this gene, the long-wave gene, and they can only see this, so their total average of colours is less, and also it's biased towards that end of the spectrum. So there we go. Some of them are quite common. If you see here, to miss the shortwave is very rare, 0.005% of the population. And of course, because it's not X-linked, it's equal in males and females. Here, 8% of the male population. If someone put up a show of hands, I would expect a number of hands to be going up in an audience this size of people who are colour deficient in one way or the other. Now, most of this doesn't affect us if we're deuteranomalous, and we're only found out if we go to the Board of Trade to have testing, either to be a pilot or more importantly, in the chemical or originally in Manchester in the textile industry, which is why people were really interested in colours. You've got to have absolutely perfect colour vision to work in the textile industry in certain jobs. Now, so we've got to test people for colour vision, because a lot of people here are colour deficient and don't know they are. In 1684, we mentioned Turberville. He was the surgeon who actually treated one of my ancestors of cancer, if you remember. He met this 32-year-old female that had excellent vision, but couldn't distinguish one colour from the next. Now, it's unusual. It's a female. So most females don't have this, because they have normal X genes. So she must have been pretty badly affected. She probably had a different disease, like a cone dystrophy, that was affecting all the receptors, rather than a genetic defect of an individual colour. But nevertheless, what he did was to ask her to name colours. This was the first colour test. What's that colour? And she didn't say red. What's that colour? She didn't say blue. She couldn't see colours. That was the test for colour vision. Now, he also had some interesting treatments. He generally provided shaving the heads and taking tobacco, which he'd often known to do much good and never did any harm to the eyes. He was famous because he cured the poor gratis. And when he was cutting the tumour off this man, he said, without anaesthetic, of course, the man was screaming. He would be expected to be screaming in pain, wasn't he? He was very still. And he said, to be sure, without doubt, this is a married man. Otherwise, it would be impossible that he could be so patient. The patient replied, no, I am but a bachelor. About 100 years later, Huddart writes a letter to Priestley. He found a Cumberland shoemaker called Harris, who could only say he's got dark shoes or light shoes, whatever the colour of the shoes were. And he picked up a sock in the road one day and took it to his neighbour, who he knew it belonged to, and said, thank you for returning my red sock. And he looked at it and he thought it looked just like all the other socks on the washing line. So at that stage, Mr. Huddart realised that he was actually colour blind and missed a beat. Two of his brothers were also affected. Here we are, X-linked, colour deficiency, discovered in the Lake District in 1777 and ignored. Now, Seebeck in Berlin decides that he's going to be a little bit more specific than holding up a sock. What colour is this sock? The same as all the other socks. He's going to actually give a whole test with hundreds of different coloured papers, and they're going to identify them to a sample and compare them. And he recognised from this that there were at least two types of colour defects, and he also recognised the anomalous, the partial defect. Now, Holmgren, who is a professor in Sweden, is the first successful test to standardise colour vision. This is Holmgren's test. So you've got these test colours, and you have to compare them out of the box. It takes about a minute to do, and he tested this on 2,220 soldiers, and if confusion occurred between them, they were colour blind. which was quite handy because what subsequently happened was in the 1st of November 1875 was this train crash. This train crash occurred because there was unclear signalling between the station master and the engine driver. The train was signalled to go, the station master said that's fine, and the train left the station to plough into this, which was coming down the same track line, and 9 people were killed in this head-on collision. It created a scandal in Sweden, and the station master was sacked and got 6 months in prison. Interestingly, nothing's mentioned about colour vision in the court papers of this at all. But it didn't stop Holgram rushing in to say, this must due to be signalling. And against all the people who they didn't want any of this doing, he went in and tested them for colour vision. And lo and behold, he found 13 of 266 railway workers were colour blind, about 4.8%, which is fitting in, roughly speaking, with what we've been talking about, slightly lower than what we would expect in our population. And he therefore concluded that colour vision was the cause of the mistaken signalling, and therefore there was a law passed that everybody who worked on the railways in Sweden had to have colour vision tests. And they do in England, and airline pilots and all of this. But actually, that wasn't the reason for the crash. The reason for the crash was the same reason as this crash, which had occurred a year earlier, which shows that people do not learn from history and do not learn from accidents, unless you're in the airline industry, where they've made a whole separate industry of learning about accidents and passing on good practice. Here, exactly the same thing happens. 2 trains were given the signal to go ahead. They both met in the middle. They were cast up in the end. You can see it's a rather gruesome thing from the evening's London Illustrated News, with this body being thrown in the air. Victorians quite liked this. You didn't read between the lines. They were quite graphic, actually. But the accident engineer, Fredwood Tyler, did invent a system which wasn't checking the colour vision. You had to have a special key which slotted into an electric device at the other end, and no train could come down that track until it was done so. And that meant your train went past. And the variants of this are still used on single track lines to this day. Now, there were developments in the test. Lord Rayleigh thought that it would be good to match up lights, and this led to the Nagel anomaliscope, and versions of this are still used today. In 1903, Williams developed the lantern test. In 1912, this is a Board of Trade lantern. It's a very, very rare example that still survives. It's got a little gas lamp in here, a little oil lamp in here, sorry, different colours around here, projected at 6 metres, 2mm test, standardised, allows sailors and subsequently airmen and various other people to be tested for colour vision. Nice little chimney on the top to let all the fumes out. I think there's only 4 of these still in existence, and this is one of them, which is in the Optical Museum in Craven Street in London. Now, there were a number of others. Pierce develops nitrocellulose chips. Farnsworth Munsell 100 hue, we'll come on to him because that's a very, very influential test. And then pseudo-isochromatic charts. Now, pseudo-isochromatic charts work because we now know that there's going to be colour confusions. So this is the normal, quaintly called able-bodied. In those days, you wouldn't be allowed to get away with any of this nowadays. And then we know that's their colour. They can distinguish between greens and blue, greens and pinks. Now then, what happens if you are protonomic? You're missing the third one. Well, here you cannot discriminate the difference between target and background, and you can't see. Tritonopes can, and deuteranopes sort of can, under the correct lighting conditions, but obviously it's going to be more difficult for them to do this. So depending which pigment you miss makes that target difficult. So you can design another target for picking up these people, if you like, or tritonopes if you wanted to, and that's where the City University test comes in, only for picking up congenital anomalies. Now, here comes the rub. This is really, really interesting. We noticed that the X-linked female could actually have an abnormal gene but still function normally. Well, what happens if that X-normal gene is also expressed in some of the cells? She's now got 4 colour. So it is quite possible there are women out there who have what we call tetrachromacy. They can see they've got these 4 receptors. Does it happen? Well, yes, it actually does. Let me just go through the genetics again. There's an abnormal gene here. It's passed on. This, normal, normal. This and this passed on. We've now got abnormal gene. It may be expressed in some cells. And look at this. We've now got much better potential for colour discrimination. And that, gentlemen, is sometimes why your wife, when you put on your nice black suit, is complaining it's a blue suit. It is possibly true that women actually do see more colours than men, or at least certain women do. apart from the ones who are colourblind. We're talking about people who have normal colour vision. Now, does that exist in real life? Well, it might do, and it's been, some work is being done in the University of California by Kimberly Jameson on this. What's very interesting about it is that it's quite controversial, because you may have 4 colour receptors here, but did God actually give you a brain that can interpret 4 signals? We know he gave us that can interpret 3, we know they can interpret 2 and 1, because we know those are in nature, but can they interpret 4? Well, it appears they might be able to, because some mice are dichromats naturally, as most mammals are, apart from primates. They've only got 2 colour receptors. Mice seem to function perfectly well. They can tell the difference between cheese and mouse poison, in my house anyway, and there seems to be no problems. But anyway, for a mouse, that's good. For us, there may be a problem. But they transfected the human gene equivalent of what they were missing, and did some experiments on these mice, and the mice could see better colours than the non-transfected mice. So it is possible that the brain could be able to use, even though it's not hardwired, maybe the brain's soft-wired, and is able to use these extra channels. In which case, why stop here? Why stop at 4? You know, you could build a female, or a male if you liked, but it's better to practice on females, they're more tolerant of this, up to 11 colours, which a mantis shrimp has. In between, a lot of animals are tetrachromats, enables them to see things like the urine traces of mice in the grass when you're at 400 feet and you're an eagle. So you know where the mouse is, because the mouse poo is ladled with a little tiny bit of urine, then it comes out. I suppose you don't want to tell mice any jokes either, for the same reason. And bang, down comes the eagle, because it can see it glowing in the dark, and hits the mouse, which thought it was doing perfectly well, hiding in the grass. Given away. Fish, they need to have lots of good colour vision, because they live in things like coral reefs, and it's nice to know what's a mantis shrimp and what isn't, if you're in that. Spiders, I don't know why spiders need a lot of colour vision, but they've got good colour vision apparently. Reptiles do, because they just inherited it. We lost this from reptiles. Our ancestors had lots of good colour vision. When we became mammals, at the same time the dinosaurs were evolving, we lived in burrows to stop dinosaurs eating us. And so we didn't need all this stuff, because it's a wasted genetic material, and we gradually lost it. We then had to reacquire it as we came out of the burrows in the Cretaceous period. So in fact, mammal colour vision is quite late, and evolved originally 1, then 2 receptors. As we said, most mammals have 2. And then in humans, there's a duplication here that occurred in one of our primate ancestors, which gives New World monkeys and humans 3 colour receptors. Sorry, Old World monkeys, 3, but the New World, which is split, they've only got 2. They're still dichromats, except for the occasional females, who through this mechanism are trichromats, and that's why sometimes you see in the New World female monkeys leading the troop, because they're better at finding fruit. So let's have a look and see. We can now, through this colour mechanism, classify objects by colour. If we don't have colour, this is what we see. As soon as we've got colour, bang, the thing of interest shoots out at us in a complex sort of textured background. So that's good. That's good if that's edible, because you can spot that straight away. And it gives you survival advantage. If you're a dichromat or an anomalous for one reason or the other, the green or the red, not so many colours, as I was trying to show you before, a little bit more difficult. So was it just for finding food? Well, trichromacy, yes, and it's quite interesting. They've done some of this about finding food with monkeys that have, primates that have 3 receptors. I'm quite intrigued, because I think more fruits in the old world are red when they're ripe than old fruits are in the new world. And I grew up as a child in the new world, and most of my fruits, I seem to remember, were yellow, things like pawpaws and bananas. And there wasn't really much red in my world. There were bits of it, some flowers were red, but that's nothing to do with me. That's to do with their ultraviolet and the bees and the hummingbirds, who have, as we know, tetrachromats. They've got 4. So for humans and, or whatever animals living in the new world, different fruits, maybe the fruits are evolving along with the animals, because there's no point being a red fruit there, you've gone past your sell-by date. So there's a very big point being a strawberry in England, because you're going to be picked out by the trichromats. The other thing trichromats can do as well is detect emotion. You can tell when someone's really, really angry with you, because they go pink and purple in the face. And that helps to be a trichromat, because it means you can walk away before you get your nose thumped. And it's also quite good to detect emotion in females, if you're a monkey, because you can tell when they're ready to say hello or not. So colour vision is obviously something that's really, really, really important for survival. So important that even anomalous colour vision is passed on and hasn't been wiped out by evolution. And in fact, colour has been used, and it's also very beautiful, and it's been used since prehistory. Here are some of the earliest images of use of painting and colour. This is carbon black. They also use some ochres, which are iron-containing earths with yellow, and the cavemen travelled up to 25 miles for these earth pigments from the Lascaux caves in France alone, and we know where the mines were. They brought them back into the caves where they ground them up and made them into paste using various gums and so on. We know that because we've got the traces in the bottom of the caves where there's natural hollows that they used as grinding bowls. And here's ochre used even today. It was also used in Wales, and in this cave they found the first human fossil, by the way, ever found, which is this here, and it was the yellow lady, the red lady of Wales. Unfortunately, it turned out not to be a lady and turned out to be a boy, the red lady of Paviland, Paleolithic, old Stone Age, before the Ice Age, which actually sort of says something about the little microclimate on this beach in Wales down here. Ochre pits mined today by Aboriginals. This is in Australia. Very ancient ochre paintings here. Even more ancient ochre, carved in this case, from South Africa, that may go back to 75,000 years ago. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it, when you think Stonehenge is 3,000 years ago, sort of thing, or 5,000 tops for some of the older stuff that we have in Europe. 75,000 years old, and they're doing art. Yellow ochre, beautiful colour, found in Lascaux, and again this is another one of the mineral arts, and this is iron oxyhydroxide. It's a slightly different chemical, gives a different colour. Carbon black, beautiful images, and again coloured here. This type of art is quite interesting because they scrape the walls, which they didn't do in the other places, to smooth it down before they painted on it. And then they made three-dimensional effects by carving into the wall. So it was a little bit more than just painting. So the first start of sort of bas-relief, I suppose. Carbon blacks, heating wood, charcoal essentially, and they've been used for sketching by artists, even found today. And we also use them in modern photocopiers and laser printers as well, carbon black. Now, were the ancient Greeks colourblind? We're going to come to this at the end, but he was a Homeric scholar and thought they were, and there was some evidence that they might be with these ancient pebble mosaics when they didn't do it. But what he'd failed to do was to look at what was coming up from the archaeological record at the same time. And here's Greek painting, admittedly of a later period, where they're using encaustic and a limited palette, 4. And it was interesting that some of the commentators on ancient Greek art were moaning about these newfangled colours that were coming in and how they were ruining the beauty of ancient art. Certainly for faces, that was limited to 4 colours and beautiful effects. I'm grateful to the monks in Mount Sinai who allowed me to show this image to you today, and I had to get special permission from them since they had their library looted by a pseudo-academic some years ago. They're very, very particular. And this is one of the oldest icons in existence. So let's have a look at some other paintings then that aren't portraits in Encaustic. Now, the original paintings, none of which exist. Do you remember Parrhasius? I told you the birds came down and pecked the grapes because they were so realistic in that competition. And Zeus said, well, let's have a look at yours. And he said, well, actually, the curtains are the painting. Well, they were using colours. Look at this, beautiful Egyptian blue. This is with kind permission from Houston. Blues, pinks, gorgeous face painting, very naturalistic and beautiful colours that are used in this ancient Greek. This is why it's called the Tomb of the Diver. He probably wasn't a diver, but it was thought that this is sort of an allegory between life and death, and that this is the symposium to welcome him into his new life. Similar frescoes are found in Etruscan tombs of the same age. Egypt. Well, look, limited palette again. Slightly more than the 4 the ancient Greeks were alleged to have, but we already know that that's not true from the paintings I've just seen you. They used iron oxide, red ochre, yellow ochre and umber as a basic palette. And interestingly enough, we have one of the palettes. This was actually found in Tutankhamun's tomb between the paws of the guarding jackal. And it was a gift to Tutankhamun from the princess. It had a number of colours on it. This was the first artificial pigment made in the world, Egyptian blue, which is calcium copper silicate. They also had azurite and a number of other ones. They used vegetable dyes principally as textiles, but also as inks, but not on the walls because they don't last on the walls. The ancient Egyptians also learnt how to fix dyes into a transparent powder, which this is called lake making. And those of you who paint will know about Madder Lake and the various lake colours. And this is how they were stabilised and enabled us to simply use them. Later on, and nowadays, they use chalk and alum or other things. And here's some gorgeous examples of early fresco painting to show where Gladstone was wrong. Blues used beautifully here. Minoan painting uses a lot of gorgeous colours. And there is a little sample of the powdered Egyptian blue. Now, the Romans made great use of pigments. We know this because a lot of their frescoes and stuff survives. In the Capitoline Museum, look at this. This is a fragment of one of the original temples in the city. Gorgeous colours, lovely blues, reds, yellows. And the ancient world was not as we imagine it. It wasn't these stark, marble-coloured buildings. They were gaudy, awful, multicoloured to our taste. Our taste, of course, has evolved through what has remained above ground. And in fact, our taste has evolved so much that in some places they scraped off in the olden days what they thought was the stain, which was actually the original paint. So we probably wouldn't have liked ancient Greece and Rome. We'd have thought it probably more like Butlins than... And here's a taste of what it might have been like. Here's one of the floors. Of course, the oldest image of Christ known is not far from here. It's in the British Museum, in another pavement in the middle, found actually in Somerset. Amazingly, why the oldest image of Christ is in Somerset, not in the Mediterranean, it's probably to do with the big iconoclasm that went on in the Byzantine Empire, which didn't reach these shores in those days due to the collapse of the Roman influence. Now, we know a lot about what they did because of these documents that survive. Probably one of the most important one was the Libro dell'Arte, and one of these copies survives, which was actually written, it says at the bottom, he wrote this, ec stincarum ec, it means I'm in the stink, and the stink was the prison in Florence. And he wrote this in July the 31st, 1434, when it probably was very stinky indeed at that time of the year. Now, he was a prisoner copying Cennini for the Pope. So many copies of this exist. He tells us how the paints are made, what they were used for. There are some earlier ones, Theophilus, we know about, the Mappa Clavicula, and Heraclius. Again, substantial amounts of their writings remain, which tell us what they were up to. Now, the early medieval painting, certainly wall painting, used a number of colours very similar to the ones that we saw in the olden days of ancient Greece and Rome that I showed you earlier. Natural chalk started to be used, and remember the beautiful Michelangelos that are going to come 500 years, 400 years later, were used by the artists then as well to make beautiful drawings. And some people actually regarded the drawings as a higher level of art than actually the painted frescoes. They used a green earth for underpainting, and we'll come on to that in a moment as well. Ultramarine from across the sea, precious lapis that was brought from Afghanistan via Persia, an amazingly expensive material, always was an expensive material, and then brought into the markets, ground and made. The most expensive material made the best and longest lasting blue. They did have another material called azurite, but azurite tends to change colour with time. It can be used, and it's not until you develop oil painting, where you can stop the chemical reactions going on, that you can start to use a lot of these pigments that they knew about. Where you can use pigments in their full beauty is in stained glass. Here we're looking at possibly the oldest stained glass in situ, which is up in the northeast of England in St Paul's Church in Jarrow. Beautiful colour blues. They learned how to do this by importing the monks originally from France, the French craftsmen. The monks then taught the local glassmaking skills. They left, and these skills were propagated locally. And the blue glass was subsequently used in other parts of the world as well. This is 7th century, and it's very, very rare and very precious because it's one of the only examples of Anglo-Saxon glass to still survive. suppose this would be a good time to talk about Pseudodionysian light metaphysics briefly, but we'll introduce this through Abbot Suger, who was friend of Louis and regent to his son. This was the famous church of Saint-Denis, Benedictine Priory, and this was where the French aristocracy and kings were buried as their place of choice. And here's some of the tombs. And underneath here is where you have the much older tombs. And they've been buried there for hundreds of years. So he decides to rebuild the church in the Romanesque style, as you can see here, and to glaze the windows, which he does. And here he is, at the feet of the Virgin Mary. This, unfortunately, is the only bit of extant of his glass that's still there in the cathedral. But there's lots of it outside the cathedral in the various museums around, and this is in the Musée du Moyen Âge. Beautiful colours, lovely greens, reds and blues. These all meant something. It wasn't that Suger liked blue, because here he is in green, donating one of the windows, which is in fact a non-coloured window, a grisaille window, that he's donating to the church. See the shape of it, exactly the same shape as this. What we see today is not what Suger saw. When he walked into this church is light, bright, airy. It's just that it's in the middle of a slum, so tourists don't go there, because when they walk out of it, they get mugged. So I'll show you what it looks like. You come down here. The most important thing, by the way, of this blue, before I move on, is what it represented. What it represented was God's light. Now, God's light was so dark, it couldn't really escape God, except to become lumen. So lux was the dark light, the holy light. Now, what is dark and non-transparent is ultramarine. Now, what they did here, by melting the precious ultramarine from mosaics, in Roman mosaics, into the soda of the glass, they made something that was opaque, transparent, which allowed the lumen to come through. And therefore, this was a very godly experience. It wasn't meant to be bright. All of his windows were taken out, and the clear story and other windows put in the 1300s, because the church was so dark, people were tripping over each other. Now, Pseudodionysius was, or Denis, see the connection between Saint-Denis, was a 5th century theologian, and the work that he wrote was ascribed to the Athenian convert of St. Paul, of course, which was the Areopagite. Now, he comes to the West as a gift of the Byzantine Michael the Stammerer, and it's given to Louis the Pious at Compiègne. Charles the Bald subsequently commissions John Scotus to translate this Greek manuscript, and it's quite interesting. The Irish and the English monks were much better at Greek than the French and Italian monks were, possibly because a lot of English or British soldiers, if you like, were being used as the guard for the Byzantine emperors at various stages through the history. Anyway, after he's done the translation, John Scotus is sitting on the table with the king, and the king leans over to him and says, "Quid distanti inter sotum et scotum?" What he said was, what is the difference, or what is the distance between an Irishman and a drunk? And John Scotus sits back and says, "The width of this table, Your Highness." Now, this is what it would have looked like. This is another cathedral not far away. This is Chartres. And look, when you walk into Chartres, I mean, I nearly tripped over my own bootlaces. It's dark as anything. Each individual window is beautiful and bright and light. Lots of that blue, lots of that Dionysian blue that's transforming the solid lux of God into this transparent lux, lumen, or light for us to see with. Beautiful windows, pretty much all intact, and well worth a visit if you want to see what Saint-Denis used to look like. We know a lot about this and how they're making it because we've got lots of images. Here they are making the glass, and they're making it in this furnace here. And we know that they used to melt precious gems in here under extreme heat, which they could generate with the bellows. Later, this darkness of glass was replaced by a much lighter glass, and later medieval glass is much less colourful than the early medieval glass. Now, in the Renaissance, developing oil painting, they were able to introduce new colours, and because the oil stops the paints having chemical reactions with each other, they're bound up, they're able to use more colours. And vermilion, which had been used in the Roman times, is brought back in. It's extremely poisonous. It's a mercuric mineral, which is found naturally, and the cinnabar mines in Spain were one of the closely guarded secrets of the Roman Empire. But then they found out how to make it artificially, and it became very important pigment because of the alchemy, the way it was made, and it was part of the steps to the Philosopher's Stone. Interestingly used as a lipstick, which is a rather nice way to dispose of your wife, I suppose, if you give her mercury as a lipstick. A number of other colours. Bone black. Now, bone black was made from two sources. You could make it from your chicken bones underneath the table, which is the cheap way, but that wasn't as good as if you made it from ivory. Now, because of the fall of the Middle East, ivory became exquisitely expensive. No longer did you have diptychs sent out as a gift to people you wanted to influence, because there was no ivory. In fact, many of these diptychs, you can see them in the V&A, are split in two, so they can recarve something on the other bit that's not there. And if you were an artist, you burnt the ivory to make ivory black, which is pretty much identical to bone black, because ivory is a type of bone. It's not exactly identical, but what was it? But it is to my eyes, and possibly to most people's eyes here. What was important about it was expensive. The material it came from. And the material it came from was as important as the way it was used. Crimson is a really important pigment, makes these gorgeous colours here. This is the coronation mantle of Roger II of Sicily, which is still in the treasury there, can be viewed today. It actually comes out of this insect, which is the Kermes insect. Had been used for a long time. But the problem is collecting these things, as you can see when they go into this pupal phase, is a bit difficult, and it was terribly, terribly expensive. So crimson was a really, really, really important, well, in fact, overtook imperial purple, which was made from the seashells of the whelks, as you know, from the, not the shells, made from the whelks inside the shells, and overtook it, and hence the red carpet treatment, if you like, because the red was very precious and expensive. It was used when it was made as a lake for painting here, the Virgin and Child, Albert Dürer, beautiful to pick out these highlights. Lovely, gorgeous colour, terribly, terribly expensive. Was replaced by the Polish version, which was cheaper, which was Carmine. Again, it's a type of carminic acid, used for dyeing. Difficult to use it for painting, but could be used for inks. Very lucrative. 1 pound of this cost 5 Venetian pounds. It peaked in the 1500s to 30 metric tons told in Sosnan. Amazing stuff. In the roots of this plant is where they pupate, and you pick them up and they're like sort of little grains. Now, Carmine superseded crimson because you need 10 times fewer of these than you do of the Kermes insect to make it. And then cochineal, much cheaper, replaced the whole lot after the conquest, used to dye the reds of the British Army, used as a food dye, and went out of fashion with the invention of artificial dyes, but is now back into fashion when they found out artificial dyes cause cancer in rats. So everybody is now out using cochineal again to dye their tablets, their medicines, their curries, and so on. And in fact, some of the older curry ones used it'll come to me. I mean, it's highly toxic. The reason why you'd want to put something so horrible into your food escapes. It was rather better eat it yellow than red, but they didn't. Vermilion, again, being used later on in this period. Here's this beautiful vermilion that's used by Titian, who's one of the great colourists, as we know. And perhaps that final painting that we see in the National Gallery of Actaeon is not Titian getting old and not being able to appreciate colour. It may just be unfinished, because others of his late paintings, as I just showed you, have magnificent colours. Greens were used to underpaint, not because they wanted people to have green faces. All it is that with the passage of years, the pinks and the reds overpainting have faded, revealing the green earth underneath. The biggest and most famous deposit of this was near Verona, and this was actually mined well up until the Second War. There were other ones, and in the Mendip Hills of England, for example, you can get some of these pigments. Blue we mentioned before, Azurite was the other blue, and I briefly wanted to talk about linguistics of colour because I was asked to talk about this. Now, originally there was this conversation recorded by Gellis about Favorinus, who says the eye sees more colours that language can distinguish, and that's very true. There may have been a limited vocabularies for colours in the ancient world and in some ancient languages, but they may have had 40 or 50 different words for the colour of horses in Kazakhstan. And so on. And in fact, Marcus Fonto replies and says, we've got 7 colours for red. Not all of them are in common use. Some of them were just used for medicine. What they concluded from studying the ancient languages that were colour impoverished in their vocabulary was that the ancients were colour blind, and that evolution had led to the modern Europeans having better colour than the ancients did. This was all the rage, of course, because they'd just discovered colour blindness from Daltonism. They'd just discovered evolution, which had come around the corner. And this mixed both of those two sexy things together, and you had this great theory. And furthermore, someone else, completely unrelated, he went and studied a whole heap of other languages, the Old Testament, ancient Indian Vedas, Icelandic sagas, and the Quran, came to the same conclusion. So, distinguishing blue from green was one of the issues. We distinguish blue and green. Many languages don't, and this is called GRU in linguistics. For example, ancient Chinese has this term, qing, which is used for a bright day, qingtian, meaning a blue sky. It's also used for green vegetables, qingcai, green vegetables. Nowadays, they have two more words for blue, and so modern Chinese has lan and lue for green, such as luecha, when you need green tea. So what do I mean by a name, identifying colours? Well, if we don't have an absolute azure, ice, blue ice, petrol, you know, these are all names for colours, but they're not primary colour terms. If I want terracotta, which one of those do you give me? So what do I mean by terracotta? It's quite important to understand this and what we're doing, particularly if you're painting the house for your loved one and you get the wrong shade of terracotta, you could be in serious trouble. Now, Berlin and Kay in 1969, very controversial this work, identified there were several languages. Stage 1, they have white and black. Stage 2, there was white, black and red was added to it. Red and green, red, yellow, and all languages seem to evolve in this order. Rather like was pointed out by the Homeric studies, that they went like the spectrum, and you added on more colours until you come to the complete stage 7. Evolved languages, of course, mostly European, but Indian and other advanced languages, so they said. Now, critique of this. There's a lot of potential errors in this story, but it's still a very interesting story to watch as it evolves, because it's got some very fundamental things to say about how we speak and how we think. I mentioned the theories of colour vision, originally the trichromatic, and then the opponent theories from Ewald Hering in a previous talk. Young, of course, the brilliant polymath, was the one who first proposed that in fact there may be just 3 types of receptors that see colour. The reason he worked that out is there's millions of colours out there, and we don't have millions of words for them, and we don't have millions of sensations for them, so perhaps if we just reduce this down to 3. He also deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs, of course, as you know. Hering said it's not 3, it's these are linked in pairs, which makes 6, and it's the opposite. And what happens is you either see a red or a green, and you never see a greenish red. And in fact, a greenish red is a term rather like a southerly northwestern breeze. And it just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense to us because of how we perceive it. On the apple, if any of you come to a venue where apples are permitted, you'll see some gorgeous colours, which I realised may not work on this computer. But nevertheless, what I'm saying here is how it works was through these P cells. And those of you who've been to a previous lecture of mine, I needn't bore you any more on that. Now, the 150th anniversary of the photograph, the first colour photograph in the world. What he also did, this is his disc. And he used to spin it round with different amounts of grey and white to make different shades of grey, and colours here on the outside. And then he found you could get a mathematical formula of which colour was seen matched to a testing strip, which was then drawn up onto this mathematical diagram as a triangle. Red, green, blue. Now, colour scales. Colour scales have been in existence since Theophilus, who described black and white, and then put red in the middle here. Francis Bacon put green in the middle here. So they weren't exactly scales, but what they were saying is colours are ordered in our perception. So take a look here. We've got a whole gamut of blues coming through here. What would be equal steps between these? How much white do I need to add to this? How much of this is white and how much of this is blue? This is what Maxwell was doing with his disc. And again, how much mixing of colours? This sort of greyish here, how much yellow it takes in that, and how much blue it takes to get this grey. I didn't think blue and yellow made grey, but it does actually, as I've just shown there. Mayer decided to address this problem by his triangles, and this was taken further by Lambert, who made the pyramid with white at the top, and this system attempted to display all the colours there were in the world. Of course he couldn't, because it doesn't describe butterflies and it doesn't describe bird wings. So that on the beagle was taken a whole list of colours which were related to the wing of a bird or the colour of a mineral and so on. So various people had all different colour scales. Goethe was a supporter, well, not so much a supporter as a proponent of an opponent's theory, and Chevreul, who worked in the industry of dyes and pigments, developed this, and it's a way of working out matches and colouring. A beautiful diagram and simultaneous disc. Runge took these colour circles and made them into solids, and these are the colour solids. He was also a painter of some renown as well. And it's further taken on by Munsell, and this is the original Munsell. Now what Munsell was describing was up here was the value, how much white or how much black is in a colour. Out here is the chroma, how many grams of pigment are there in this sample. And then round here is the hue, whether it's red, blue, green, orange, yellow, whatever hue you like. And that was the Munsell system. The Bauhaus, very influential in drawing colour circles, Albers. Subtractive colours, how it works is that if we want a red, it reflects red and it absorbs this. If we want a purple, it's got to absorb the green. And if we want to have the blue, it's got to absorb the red. And this is how we can make colours. It's not quite intuitive, but you'll see how it works by playing with it. Now, the colour space is a cone, and this can be mapped out. We're going to come on to this with the CIE in a moment to show that in more detail. And what they did was to get observers to tune in this and with 3 colours until they match that. Then, bing, that's that number there. Then change the colour, tune in again, bing, it's here. And from that, they were able to make a diagram where they were able to plot the colours. Looks a little bit similar, doesn't it, to the tri-stimulus we mentioned before. Now, the natural colour system is based on all of this, and this is a little bit easier to use, many companies use this. For example, Virgin say that this is their red. And you can go to the natural colour system and you can find Virgin red here, or a Ferrari red here. And it has a number attached to it based on where it is in the hue, how saturated or not saturated it is. Oh, here we go. There's the Virgin red, S108. Y9R. Why is that important? Because this projection on the screen is not virgin red. This is a much bluer red because of the way the projection's done. But you can go and get virgin red now if you know those numbers. You go along to the natural colour system, you leaf through it, that's the red I want. You can go and match the paint. You can go and set up your own airline, as long as you don't call it virgin, and as long as he hasn't patented that colour. My next door neighbour is actually quite famous because he's the one who did the Marlboro red, which is on Ferrari and on the back of cigarette packets. That's what it looks like. Very functional, very easy to use. Lots of characteristics of colour that you can read about when you download, if you can be bothered to download. You can see how this all works, and I'm not going to bore you with this. Finally, what I wanted to come to was what is colours and what aren't colours. We know what they are spectrally now. We also know that there's non-spectral colours, which we can't make by mixing lights together. We also know that intuitively that colours are different depending on the surface they come from. So, reflectance and the texture affects it. It also affects by what light is shone on them. You see this A and this B, they look like quite different colours. In fact, if we mask them, they're exactly identical. And this is the colour constancy that we mentioned before. This shade and this are exactly the same colour, although this one looks white. And in fact, when we mask it, you can actually see they are the same colour. And again, I'll refer you back to the previous lecture where we dealt with that in detail. And furthermore, colour constancy is quite important about, and the Retinets theory of Edwin Land was proposed to explain that. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Colour and books.